Good morning, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of the Song of the Lark. Um, we're going to start today with a little bit of information about the role that Chicago plays. Um, it's probably interesting to us given that we live so close to Chicago and we've probably all been there 40, 100 times. This is just a little snippet about Chicago. It's obviously the largest city in the Midwest where Taya pursues her musical education in the 1890s, at the same time that Chicago itself is experiencing a renaissance in the arts. Taya's Chicago piano teacher, Andor Harsani, um, soon recognizes that Taya's real future is in singing and arranges for another mentor, Madison Bowers, to give her vocal lessons. Taya's artist self is also awakening by hearing the Chicago Symphony perform and by visiting the Chicago Art Institute, where she sees the painting by French artist Jules Breton. That's the picture that we saw of a young peasant girl awakening to the possibilities of life. The title of Breton's painting, The Song of the Lark, provides the title of both the novel and this second section. In Chicago, Taya begins to have success as a singer and meets the wealthy Fred Ottenberg. So that's one piece. And then I have something else here about Chicago. Um, Taya's quest takes her to Chicago, where she finds a proper discipline for her desire. Art requires hard work, she learns, especially for those few with great ability. She realizes also that she cannot be a concert pianist. The lack of early training cannot be overcome. Her true medium is the voice, the instrument through which she can unlock the strong, intimate spirit inside her. The conversion from piano to voice, like the larger artistic and intellectual ripening, is from the artificial to the natural. That's interesting, isn't it? Her piano teacher accidentally discovers her real gift. Once exposed, the voice is gently encouraged to follow its natural strengths. The method Harsani adopts in training Taya's voice recalls Willa Cather's literary approach, as expressed in Three American Singers, from the controlling idea, that's a short story, of a piece to the individual passage, from the larger feeling or intuition to interpretation, from intention to specification. So that's interesting. The controlling idea to the individual passage, from the larger feeling or intuition to interpretation, from intention to specification. The approach also corrects the aimless freedom once permitted. Taya's reading of De Lorelei enhances Harsani's technique. Simply singing the song does not satisfy Taya. We'll see that. She voices that concern. A beautiful voice alone does not properly convey the meaning of music. The concluding bars of the song, as she first sings them, displease her because her conception does not make with Heine's lyric with the melody. Remember, she says, and we'll get to this today, I think. She says, something's weird about the end of this piece. Unless each part belongs to an conception, a reading has no uh, cogency. When she grasps the idea of a river enduring beneath the havoc, Taya gives the end of De Lorelei an open, flowing tone to suggest continuity. So she interprets the music until she can convey it the way she believes it's supposed to be conveyed. Her teacher is suggesting a method congenial to her nature and testing the girl's ability to reach the idea behind melody. The idea behind melody. Through the facts of the tale are in the future, De Lorelei foreshadows a journey beset with danger. It will be Taya's journey on the Rhine of artistic ambition, the old tale of man's need for expression. The strange splendors and exquisite allurements which in the end destroy the voyager are the countless obstacles hindering expression. So again, the strange splendors and exquisite allurements which in the end destroy the voyager are the countless obstacles hindering expression. And Taya is able to manage the expression by comprehending the melody. So that's just a little bit about that. So we're going to turn to the text. Yes, we're going to turn to the text. We're a little bit more behind than I like to be, so we'll make some progress today. We left off on page 60. We're still in the Friends of Childhood, and here in chapter 9, we explore some the life that they live. Mrs. Kronberg is stern. She took Taya more seriously without thinking about much about why she did so. We're going to see Mrs. Kronberg's management of this family. Cather is really trying to convey to us her experience with the immigrant women out there in Colorado. At the top of page 61, we have a picture of the addle-pated aunt. I love that phrase, addle-pated. She's kind of dingy. There is a belief that people who are foolish about the more obvious things of life are apt to have peculiar insight into what lies beyond the obvious. I think that's really, really interesting, especially to me, because most of you know that I wrote a book a number of years ago in which I identified the way disabled characters are used in fiction. Of course, my interest comes from the fact that I have a disabled sister, and which of course is what brought me to Jane in the first place. But this is the truth speaker, and that's Tilly. Tilly, in this case, the way Cather is identifying her is that while she might be a little bit dingy, she can, in some instances, convey truth, which was one of the characterizations that I made in my own book. Next couple of lines, Tilly's mind was a curious machine. When she was awake, it went round like a wheel when the belt has slipped off, and when she was asleep, she dreamed follies. But she had intuitions. That's the truth speaker element. So Heather goes on to talk about a number of the things that Tilly does. If we go over to page 62, at the end of the bigger paragraph in the middle, there was a string in her somewhere that Tilly could pull. A sense of obligation to Tilly's misguided aspirations. The saloon keepers had some feeling of responsibility towards Spanish Johnny. So we're going to get a little insight into him as well. Look over on page. I wrote something here in the mic. Oh, I know. On page 63. Do you remember Nellie Olson in Little House on the Prairie? It's as if this Lily Fisher is the same kind of character. This made me laugh. Some members of the club suggested Taya Kronberg, others advocated Lily Fisher. This is to be singing. Lily's partisans urged that she was much prettier than Taya and had a much sweeter disposition. Do you remember that? I'm sure you all watched Little House on the Prairie the way my family did. But Lily Fisher reminds me of Nellie Olson. So if we go over on to the next page, 64, at the very top, oh, I guess Taya hasn't got time to do any showing off. Her time to show off ain't come yet. I expect she'll make us all sit up when it does. No use asking her to take the part. She'll turn her nose up at it. I guess they'd be glad to get her in the Denver dramatics if they could. A little foreshadowing to what's going to occur in subsequent chapters. So then, next chapter 10 on page 64, it begins. Wunsch and old Fritz and Spanish Johnny celebrated Christmas together so joyously. That's funny. That Wunsch was unable to give Taya her lesson the next day. So joyously. In other words, they got stinking drunk. down at the bottom, let's see, this is Mrs. Kohler. She called Taya to come and look at a bantam egg, which she had held up proudly. Her bantam hens were remiss in zeal, and she was always delighted when they accomplished anything. Um, I just thought that was kind of backhanded of Cather. Her bantam hens were remiss in zeal. In other words, they're not as zealous as Wunsch and Old Fritz and Spanish Johnny in their celebration of Christmas. Those are the chickens. Um, then let's see, at the bottom of page, no, this is in the middle of page 65. I forgot to turn my notes. Chapter 10. Um, at the top of page 65, Wunsch came down wearing an old padded jacket. Yeah, it says wadded is padded. I think that what this looked like, I looked it up. Of course I did. This looks like the down jackets that we all wear nowadays. You know, the down ones with the puffy little sections. I think that's pretty much what a wadded jacket looked like. Then at the end of this paragraph, it was a very old Leipzig edition of the piano score of Gluck's Orpheus. Maybe it comes later. It does come later. Um, but Orpheus is an opera by the German composer Christoph Willibald Gluck, whose dates are 1714 to 1787, based on the Greek myth, first performed in Vienna in 1762. Gluck was the first effective reformer of the opera before Wagner. Both composers were determined to rid the genre of the artifice and excess associated with the Italian tradition. Then at the end of this page, there's some German von Black. I have that somewhere. Oh, now vom Blatt mit, which means follow the score, accompany me. Whenever we run across Wunsch, there's quite a bit of German, and I took German when I was in third grade, so there's not a whole lot left except eins, zwei, drei. That's all. So I had to look a bunch of this up. And he's saying now, come on, Taya, accompany me. And then at the bottom of this page is some more German. Uh, and it's I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. I have lost you. Gone now is the main on earth above. It's some lines from this opera, and the same thing on the next page at the top. Some additional lines. It doesn't really um, elucidate the text all that much. But I think that Cather is trying to give us some authenticity in Wunsch. But what's interesting here is not so much the German translation, but the kind of random approach that Wunsch had to um, to Taya's piano playing. And we saw that critics say that her she could never recover really from this kind of random uh, uh, um, approach to her piano playing, which is what later led her to using and elucidating her voice rather than the piano. Down at the bottom of page 66, Wunsch went on. It is written for alto, you see. A woman sings the part, and there was only one to sing that good in there. Um, and Wunsch is referring to Pauline Villardo Garcia, who is a Spanish mezzo soprano who had tremendous success in the role of Orfeo. The role was originally written for a castrato, later for a tenor. In the 19th century, it was generally performed by female contraltos. Um, and he's making a reference to that. And I think what we're supposed to know that is that once, though he's a little random in his approach to teaching, he does have some depth of knowledge. This came from somewhere, and what we see in him, though, is that he somehow got off the track, literally, and now has become more or less a wanderer. Um, on the top, no, it's the middle of page 67. Um, he says, let's see, was she the greatest singer you ever heard? And Wunsch nodded gravely. Quite so. She was the most. He hunted for an English word, lifted his hand over his head, and snapped his fingers noiselessly in the air, enunciating fiercely. And those lines are, um, it means artistic. That's foreshadowing, of course, because what we're seeing in Taya, even at this young age, is the unfolding of her artistic self. Okay. At the top of page 68, there's a Mrs. Kohler is cooking a Hassenpfeffer. It's a highly seasoned hare rabbit braised in red wine, a popular German dish. Again, to give some authenticity to the Kohlers and their Germanness. Um, those, let's see, number 4. No, I have a note to myself and I don't know what I mean. Just hate when that happens. I'm not absolutely sure. So we'll just move on. It'll occur to me as we go. Next, in the next chapter, 11, I wrote a note to myself about the scenic detail. And we have heard from a number of critics who say that Cather focused too much on that, and yet I find the detail really compelling. Next paragraph, or a second paragraph. After the lesson, they went out to join Mrs. Kohler, who had asked Taya to come early so that she could stay and smell the linden bloom. It was one of those still days of intense light when every particle of mica, and you've probably seen mica. It's sometimes that flaky, shiny bits that you can see in the soil. And she says every particle of mica in the soil flashed like a little mirror, and the glare from the plain below seemed more intense than the rays from above. I just thought that this was really beautiful. The sand ridges ran glittering gold out to where the mirage licked them up, shining and steaming like a lake in the tropics. The sky looked like blue lava, forever incapable of clouds, a turquoise bowl that was the lid of the desert. Isn't that beautiful? I just made notes to myself that it was Cather's ability to paint the scenery. Um, then the next paragraph is about Mrs. Kohler's garden. We have seen from one critic that she has created this little paradise in the middle of the desert. Um, then down towards the bottom of page 69, you know that von Hein, um, and he says something in German. It was written for, whoops, I'm in the wrong place. Heinrich Heine, and that's who Heine is, 1767 to 1856. He was a romantic German lyric poet, frequently cited by Cather. The poem, accurately titled, is number 45 from his, like his intermezzo. Sorry, my German is just not up to the task. One of his poems was one of the most widely read and influential books of poetry in Germany. Many of his songs were set to music. Um, so he's making a reference to this poet Heine, flüstern, to whisper. Yeah, that's what that means. He provides us the translation. If you look at the top of page 70, there is always a way, and if someday you are going to sing, it is necessary to know well the German language. Well, luckily, I'm not ever going to sing, so I don't know the German language. But here's an interesting passage. That is for you to say, returned Wunsch coldly. You would better marry some Jacob here and keep the house for him, maybe. That is as one desires. So he's suggesting to her that, notice the tone in his voice is cold. He doesn't want her to do that. He thinks that would be a waste. Next paragraph. Taya flashed up at him a clear, laughing look. No, I don't want to do that. She brushed his coat sleeve quickly with her yellow head. Only how can I learn anything here? It is so far from Denver. And next paragraph. Nothing is far and nothing is near if one desires. The world is little, people are little, human life is little. There is only one big thing, desire. And he sees that desire in her. And before it, when it is big, all is little. It brought Columbus across the sea in a little boat, und so weiter. So he sees this talent in her early on. Down at the bottom again is more of this beautiful detail. As they went up and down the gravel paths between the flower beds, the white and yellow butterflies kept darting before them, and the pigeons were washing their pink feet at the drip and crooning in their husky bays. Oh, I just think that's so. No one looks at pigeons' feet, but I have a bird palace out in my front yard, a huge bird palace, and the pigeons sit in there, and now I've noticed their little pink feet. Um, Before, what I really noticed was that they're so big, they sit in the bird palace and they scare away the little ones. But now I've noticed their pink feet. If we look at the top of page 71, this is a poem. And we get at first the German, and then we get the English translation. And Wunsch had noticed before that when his pupil read anything in verse, the character of her voice changed altogether. More foreshadowing. It was no longer the voice which spoke the speech of Moonstone. It was a soft, rich contralto, and she read quietly. The feeling was in the voice itself, not indicated by emphasis or change of pitch. So he knows. He knows about her. At the end of this paragraph, it was a nature voice, Wunsch told himself, breathed from the creature apart from language, like the sound of the wind in the trees or the murmur of water. And this is one of those passages that requires a star, because what Wunsch is recognizing is the art. Next page. Next paragraph, or at the top of page 72, they had come back to the grape arbor, and Taya picked out a sunny place on the bench where a tortoise-shell cat was stretched out at full length. She sat down, bending over the cat and teasing his whiskers, because he had been awake all night thinking about her, wasn't it? Maybe that was why he was up so early. They're talking about the poem. At the end of the next paragraph, I meant it was only when he came out in the morning that she seemed to him like that, like one of the flowers, awakening in the morning. And down at the bottom of page 72, okay. Oh, there's some German here at the bottom that means spirit, imagination, and rhythm. For a singer, there must be something in the inside from the beginning. I shall not be long in this place, maybe, and I like to know. Yes, he ground his heel in the gravel. Yes, when you are barely 6, you must know that already. She did. She knew. That's why she squirreled herself up in the attic. That is the beginning of all things. And here's the lines that mean rhythm. I mean spirit, imagination, and rhythm. It must be in the baby when it makes its first cry, like Der Rhythmus, or it cannot be. You have some voice already, And if in the beginning, when you are with things to play, you know that when you will not tell me, then you can learn to sing, maybe. He already can see this in her. And we're going to see she's going to go off to Chicago to learn to play piano. And it's there that her voice is again discovered. But while Wunsch is maybe not, maybe he's kind of all over the place in his teaching of her, he has enough insight into artistic development to know. Down at the bottom of, wait, I'm over at the top of page 73. He threw up his square head and shook it, all the fingers apart and wagging. Purple and breathless, he went out of the arbor and into the house without saying goodbye. These outbursts frightened Wunsch. They are always harbingers of ill. In fact, what it is, remember early on, Wunsch was always afraid of his intuition because he thought it would bring bad luck. But in fact, what it brings is his recognition of art. Next paragraph, a few lines down, she was shaken by a passionate excitement. She did not altogether understand what Wunsch was talking about, and yet, in a way, she knew. This is a starred passage. She knew, of course, that there was something about her that was different, but it was more like a friendly spirit than like anything that was a part of herself. She brought everything to it, and it answered her. Happiness consisted of that backward and forward movement of herself. The something came and went. She never knew how. That's the artistic spirit. So it's in her, and she's still young, so she can't elicit it quite. At the bottom of this page. And when it was there, everything was more interesting and beautiful, even people. When this companion was with her, she could get the most wonderful things out of Spanish Johnny or Wunsch or Dr. Archie. And recall, last week I read an article in which we identified, or the critic identified, that these characters, they are her friends, but they are also in their own way artistic. At the top of the next page, 74, this is about 4 lines down, and yet she knew that she was going to leave them all behind someday. They would be changing all day long, yellow and purple and lavender, and she would not be there. From that day on, she felt there was a secret between her and Wunsch. Together, they had lifted a lid, pulled out a drawer, and looked at something. They hid it away and never spoke of what they had seen, but neither of them forgot it. So she has matured a little. She recognizes she has the artistic spirit, but it's not ready to come out quite yet. If we look in the next chapter, she is visiting Dr. Archie, and they are outside. This is an interesting chapter because we get some insight into Dr. Archie at the top of this page. No, page 75. He says something. You must know about all Wunsch can teach you by this time, recognizing that Wunsch is limited. Um, I'm afraid he won't be around much longer, said the doctor. He's been making a tank of himself lately. In other words, he and the others are drinking quite a bit. Um, what the deuce are we all here for anyway, Taya? He said abruptly. And remember, Taya said a while ago that he talks to her as if she were an adult, not as if she's a child. Down at the bottom of 75, I suppose I'm here, says Dr. Archie, because I married as soon as I got out of medical school and had to get a practice quick. If you hurry things, you always get left in the end. At the top of page 76. But here it's all like the sand. Blows north one day and south the next. We're all a lot of gamblers without much nerve, playing for small stakes. The railroad is the one real fact in this country. That has to be. The world has to get back and forth. But the rest of us are here just because it's the end of the run. And the engine has to have a drink. That is a much quoted line. Moonstone is the end of the run. That's all it is. It's the end of the run. And someday I'll get up and find my hair turning gray, and I'll have nothing to show for it. Um, he has quite a bit of sadness about him. Remember, we also he's got a very unappealing wife, um, but he married her. She was cute at the time, and then it all kind of just dribbled off. But I have an article here by someone named Annette R. Dolph, who's from the Ohio State University. They always say that, the Ohio State. That's where my daughter Jean went to veterinary school, and they were adamant. They were all adamant. It's the Ohio State. This um, this article is entitled Place, Inspiration, and the Railroad in Willa Cather's The Song of the Lark. And she begins in Willa Cather's The Song of the Lark, Moonstone's local physician, Dr. Archie, feels discontent and has a late night conversation with Taya in which he centralizes the importance of the railroad to the very existence of this isolated town. The town is there, he notes, somewhat bitterly, and merely because it is the end of the run and a place for the train to refuel. That is over on that's on page 76. Moonstone, as he describes it, ironically fuels technological progress for society at large at the same time it oppresses an individual's growth. The foundationless, changeable conception of Moonstone that Archie has stands in sharp contrast with his memory of Michigan, the place where he feels he has a history. And he says that when he's in Michigan, he's known because of his father's people. And we probably even experienced that ourselves, that especially if you were born in Milwaukee or in the area, that your name is known. I have a friend who grew up in Grafton. This is my co-teacher in the jail. She grew up in Grafton. She knows everybody, and everybody knows her. Um, and I don't find that. I recently moved to Cedarburg, and nobody knows me. People sort of knew me in Mequon, but Mequon is a place of a lot of transplants. In fact, like Moonstone a bit. Despite the importance he gives to place-based ties, however, his speech reveals that he accepts the railroad as a given fact. The railroad, which, as Leo Marx describes it, challenges the stability of place by dissolving regional barriers and enabling mobility. So, of course, when we think of the railroad, we think of Chicago, because Chicago was in the center of an artistic development, but also of an industrial development, all promoted by the railroad, in and out, and in and out, and in and out. Um, let's see what. While life in Moonstone is shaped by regional geography, however, it is also shaped by the presence of the railroad, as Archie suggests. Whoops. Once Taya is in Chicago, she explains to her music teacher, um, Professor Harsani, how the people in little desert towns live by the railroad and order their lives by the coming and going of the trains. And we already seen this in the description of Ray, that um, his life is directed by the coming and going of the trains. And it isn't always on a schedule. For him, he might be called at in the morning, or he might be called at the nighttime in order to um, run the train. Moonstone and those who live there then are shaped by the town's geographic location, both relative to the southwestern landscape and the town's proximity to the railroad itself. The train in The Song of the Lark becomes a symbolic sort of place in and of itself. Through its association with Ray Kennedy, at the same time, it takes on the influential, stable qualities of a home or the interior space itself. So when Ray takes Taya and her mother to Denver, they ride in this little homey car that Ray keeps um, homey and clean, and he's very fussy about it. And in fact, I think that Cather uses the word fussy. Um, Further, the presence of the railroad shapes not only Moonstone, but Taya's shifting perceptions and connections with the town and the landscape in general as she drives via the train. She's going to take the train quite a bit. Um, After Taya leaves Moonstone, she begins to share Dr. Archie's view that Moonstone limits those who live there as she comes to realize the limits of the musical training she was able to receive as a child through Wunsch. While the novel thus highlights the importance of place to intellectual development, it also points out that the place of inspiration can be mobile, such as Ray Kennedy's train car. Isn't that interesting? I just think that's a really interesting observation because that is, in fact, what we see in that railroad car. Um, in the novel, Ray Kennedy is closely aligned with the railroad. Not only is he literally associated with the railroad as a conductor on a freight train, but his quiet presence in the novel is the driving force behind Taya's ability to leave Moonstone to advance her artistic training, just as the railroad itself is. So we're going to see what happens to Ray, um, but he's the impetus for her ability to leave, and so he's connected to the train, and that connection between the Ray and the train is just fascinating. If we, and I'm going to continue. The railroad he made his living working for becomes the physical means that transports her from town to city. Ray, and by extension the railroad, lies at the very heart of Taya's ability to gain artistic training in the city, and thus is foundational to the person she becomes by the end of the novel. It's Ray. It's Ray. Perhaps most importantly, however, her trip to Chicago alters her perspective on life in Moonstone dramatically, and it is Ray and the railroad that makes this trip possible. Fascinating discussion about the rail. Um, so we look back into our text on top of page 77. Oh no, 76. She's still talking to Dr. Archie. You've got something up your sleeve, haven't you? Anything you like. Only don't marry and settle down here without giving yourself a chance, will you? So he's seen in her the secret that Wunsch and Taya discovered when they opened the drawer. It's that secret, deep artistic self. At the top of 77, but Wunsch is the only one that can teach me what I want to know. I've got to learn to do something well, and that's the thing I can do. And he asks her, do you want to become a music teacher? Which is very limiting. She says, but I want to be a good one. Uh, I'd like to go to Germany to study someday, where there's the romantic prose. And then let's see, over on page 78. She shot round the house to the kitchen door, and Dr. Archie watched her disappear with a sigh. He thought of the hard, mean, frizzy little woman who kept his house for him. That's his wife. What an awful thought. At the end of this page, I wonder if all of my life's going to be a mistake just because I made a big one. Then, hardly seems fair. Oh, so sad. Howard Archie in the next paragraph was respected rather than popular in Moonstone. A few lines later, but a great many people thought Archie distant, and they were right. He had the uneasy manner of a man who is not among his own kind and who has not seen enough of the world to feel that all people are in the same sense his own kind. Seems to me he's rather shy, and sometimes shy people seem distant or unfriendly. But I think that's Dr. Archie. He knew that everyone was curious about his wife, that she played a sort of character part in Moonstone, and that people made fun of her, not very delicately. Sometimes Cather is kind of merciless with her description. Um, he married a mean woman, and he must accept the consequences. The tenets of the Presbyterian Church in which he had grown up, though he had long ceased to believe in them, still influenced his conduct and his conception of propriety. So he married her, he stuck with her. It's very sad. But to him, there was something vulgar about divorce, so it's not an option. Respectability was so necessary to Archie that he was willing to pay a high price for it, suggesting maybe that he doesn't have the courage to move on. Um, at the end of this paragraph, had there been another woman for whom he cared greatly, he might have had plenty of courage, but he was not likely to meet such a woman in Moonstone. So there's the dead end. It's the end of the line. He had not the courage to be an honest thinker. So he does lack courage. In the next page, at the top of page 80, although Dr. Archie could not bring himself to regard marriage merely as a social contract, but look upon it as somehow made sacred by a church in which he did not believe. As a physician, he knew that a young man whose marriage is merely nominal must yet go on living his life. That's really sad. He Next, a few lines later, he honestly believed that anything was better than divorce. He often told himself that hanging and wiving go by destiny. If wiving went badly with a man, and it did oftener than not, then he must do the best he could to keep up appearances and help the tradition of domestic happiness along. And you can see the religious element of it. It's propriety. It's stick to it, because his church doesn't approve of a divorce. Down at the bottom of page 80. The determining factor about Dr. Archie was that he was romantic. He married Belle White because he was romantic, too romantic to know anything about women except what he wished them to be, or to repulse a pretty girl who had set her cap for him. And that's what she did. And then she got him, and then she kind of withered up. Um, he's reading, and of course we always get lots of insight into people by what books they choose. Flint's Physiology, I happen to know what that is. It's a textbook of human physiology by Austin Flint, published in 1876. The American poet and essayist Oliver Wendell Holmes was also a physician, and many of his poems concern doctors and medicine. So those are the two things that he typically likes to read. At the end of that paragraph on page 81, when he was tending them, one saw him at his best. She's talking about his patients. Then his constraint and self-consciousness fell away from him. He was easy, gentle, competent, master of himself and of other people. Then the idealist in him was not afraid of being discovered and ridiculed. But I think in contrast, in his personal life, he's shy. He's not confident. In his tastes, the doctor was romantic. Though he read Balzac all the year through, he still enjoyed Waverley novels as much as when he first came upon them. Waverley novels are enormously influential novels by Sir Walter Scott, who invented the historical novel, like Ivanhoe. Scott was avidly read and imitated throughout the 19th century. Um, so a few lines later, he likes Scott's women, Constance de Beverley and the minstrel girl in The Fair Maid of Perth, not the Duchess de Longueuil. Those references are, let's see. Beverley was the heroine of Scott's Marmion. She's a nun who breaks her vows for the sake of love and is punished by being buried alive. Way interesting, isn't it? Because we just saw that portrait of Archie's marriage and his stick with itness. In The Fair Maid of Perth, the minstrel girl throws herself from a cliff when her secret lover, the prince, is murdered. So those are really romantic portraits of love and marriage. Well, let's see. Then there's a reference to Robert Burns' Death and Dr. Hornbook and the Jolly Beggars. Burns' reply to his tailor. Of course, we know Burns. He's the Scottish national poet and songwriter, much admired by his contemporaries. He wrote equally well in English, and in his native Gaelic. A few lines later, he used to read Tam O'Shanter to Taya Kronberg, and he got her some of the songs set to the old airs for which they were written. Tam O'Shanter, of course, is Burns. Next chapter, let's see. At the beginning of June, that's where we are. Life was pleasant and uneventful until the 1st of September, when Winch began to drink so hard that he was unable to appear when Taya went to take her midweek lesson. Heather often drops little tiny hints about what is coming, and in this case, Winch is declining for some reason. Let's see. On Saturday morning, she set out for the Kohlers again, but on her way, when she was crossing the ravine, she noticed a woman sitting at the bottom of the gulch under the railroad trestle. She turned from her path and saw it was Mrs. Talamantes. That's Spanish Johnny's wife, and she seemed to be doing drawn work. I didn't know what drawn work was, or maybe I looked it up a couple of chapters ago. It's embroidery. She's embroidering, or maybe it's even something like what's it called? Needlepoint. Uh, she ran up the gulch and called to Mrs. Telamentis. The Mexican woman held up a warning finger. Taya glanced at the blanket and recognized a square red hand which protruded. The middle finger twitched slightly. And so Mrs. Talamentes is sitting with the unconscious man here who's just laying there. And it's Wunsch. Probably he had been trying to get home and had lost his way. He is drinking so much that he's passed out here. And Mrs. Talamentes had sent Spanish Johnny to get help. So this is really a pathetic scene because Wunsch has declined a great deal. Over on page 84, right in the middle of the page, Wunsch was like a dead man. He lay unconscious all day. Ray Kennedy stayed with him till 2 o'clock in the afternoon when he had to go out on his run. It was the first time he had ever been inside the Kohlers' house, and he was so much impressed by Napoleon that remember that was that piecework. That formed a new bond between him and Taya. Over on the top of page 85, letters are so small. Guess I'd better put the soft pedal on him. And so he took out a hypodermic. He's giving him perhaps maybe a sedative because he's so drunk. And then in the next paragraph, his face was snarling and savage, and his eyes were crazy. He had risen to avenge himself, to wipe out his shame, to destroy his enemy. He's angry at having been found in such a bad condition and then requiring so many people to participate in his aid. Down at the bottom of page 85, Ach, das Mistbeet. That's manure. Hearing her hotbed the poor soul Fritz, he will cut himself. Ach, what is that? This is Mrs. Kohler. They both sat up in bed. Again, ach, what is he doing? At the top, he's crazed. I think he's maybe still drunk, but at least conscious. So he runs out to the garden and he's got an axe and he's chopping down the trees. The die Baum, those are trees, and he's chopping at them. And then he goes after the dove house. He leaves the trees alone, but the dove house goes down. There in the faint starlight, they saw a bulky man, barefoot, half-dressed, chopping away at the white posts that formed the pedestal of the dove house. That practically made me cry because you can see the doves in their little teeny pink feet, and their house is going down. Down at the bottom of page 86, she was reproaching herself for nagging Fritz when he drank himself into foolish pleasantry or mild sulks, and felt that she had never before appreciated her blessings. It's an interesting contrast because Fritz doesn't get angry. He gets maybe sulky or a little bit frisky when he's drunk. But there's also a contrast here to Mrs. Archie. Mrs. Archie is this, that rigid, skinny woman with frizzy hair. or maybe it's just frizzy bangs. I hope it's not frizzy hair. Um, but that's a contrast. Mrs. Kohler appreciates her own husband, whereas Mrs. Archie just does not. So there's a bunch of gossip, of course. Um, the Kohlers were unremitting in their kindness to their friend, but he doesn't seem to be able to recover from his drunken behavior. Um, this was really interesting. Mid page, after Paulina had cleaned the pages with fresh bread, Wunsch was amazed to see what a fine book he had. I've never heard of that, but apparently, I looked this up. Apparently, you can use fresh bread to clean paintings. Didn't know that. But she cleans up the music score, which had become soiled. Um, Down at the bottom of page 87, he thinks about a Frusries, which is a hiking or walking tour that he had through the Hartz Mountains in his student days. Um, then there's on page 88, he cleans up this musical score and thinks and thinks and thinks, and we can see something is happening here. And he writes on the musical score that he's going to give to Taya Einst o Wonder, and it translates as, I believe, once a miracle. It's from a song. The line is from a solo and voice piano song by Beethoven. Um, he remained a Wunsch to the end of his chapter there. Oh, he's leaving. And we knew this. Since he had lost all of his pupils, they all forsake him because of his drunken behavior. Um, and we know that he's going to leave. Uh, I'm not sure. I just hate when I can't remember why I've uh, made a reference. If you look over on page 89, he's he gets on the train. Goodbye, Herr Wunsch. Goodbye, she called, waving to him. She has run to the train, knowing that he's gotten on it. He thrust his head out the window and called back, Lieb wohl, mein Kind. Live well, my child, is what he says. She had been running. She will run a long way. They cannot stop her. Yeah, that's true. He knows. But his life has come to an end in Moonstone. Uh, What was it about the child that one believed in? Was it her dogged industry, so unusual in this free and easy country? Was it her imagination? More likely it was because she had both imagination and a stubborn will, curiously balancing and interpenetrating each other. There was something unconscious and unawakened about her that tempted curiosity. This is another starred passage. We were getting the overview from the narrator through Wunsch's view of her. She had a kind of seriousness that he had not met within a pupil before. She hated difficult things, and yet she could never pass one by. They seemed to challenge her. She had no peace until she had mastered them. She had the power to make a great effort to lift a weight heavier than herself. In the next paragraph, towards the bottom of 89, it was a face full of light and energy, of the unquestioning hopefulness of first youth. Yet she was like a flower full of sun, but not the soft German flowers of his childhood. He had it now, the comparison he had recently reached for before. She was like the yellow prickly pear blossoms that opened there in the desert, thornier and sturdier than the maiden flowers he remembered. Not so sweet, but wonderful. I'm sure you know what a prickly pear is. I tried to get a picture and I couldn't copy and paste it. It was taking me too long. But a prickly pear is one of those, they're kind of flat, and then they have different pieces like this, and then they're green and have little um, thorns, and sometimes they bloom yellow and orange on the edge of the flat pieces that go off like this. I hope that's a good description. Um, Next paragraph, people who have lived long together need a third at table. They knew each other's thoughts so well that they have nothing left to say. So Wunsch has left, and the Kohlers are really sad. Fritz and he had been buddies, and Mrs. Kohler um, liked to care for him. And it's as if these two have a bit lost their purpose. At the bottom of page 90, Wunsch would never come back. Oh, the poor man. She knew that. He would drift on from new town to new town, from catastrophe to catastrophe. Mm. But down at the bottom of page 90, Fritz, smoking his pipe in the kitchen doorstep, watched his Paulina and guessed her thoughts. He too was sorry to lose his friend, but Fritz was getting old. He had lived a long while and had learned to lose without struggle. So he has come to some sort of peace about Wunsch's departure. Um, at the top of the next chapter, Copper Hole was a settlement 15 miles northwest of Moonstone, where Mr. Kronberg preached every Friday evening. There was a big spring there, and a creek and a few irrigating ditches. It was a community of discouraged agriculturists who had disastrously experimented with dry farming. I couldn't really find much uh, to define what is dry farming. I think it's trying to farm out in the desert and farm things that are really from the Atlantic coast, which was much more fertile. Um, Next paragraph, there's um, a description, a revelation of Tor, Taya's brother. Tor, of course, was not accurately speaking a baby any longer. In the matter of nourishment, he had long been quite independent of his mother, though his independence had not been one without struggle. Tor was a conservative in all things. His kid's about 5, I think, and the whole family had anguished with him when he was being weaned. Being the youngest, he was still the baby for Mrs. Kronberg, though he was nearly 4. Okay, not 5. And he sat up boldly on her lap that afternoon. So Mrs. and Mr. Kronberg are going off to this place called Copper Hole at the top of page 92. Oh, I'm not moving along very fast. She had a rather unusual capacity for getting the flavor of places and of people. This is Mrs. Kronberg, and remember, she's had insight into Taya's nature. Although she was so enmeshed in family cares most of the time, she could emerge serene when she was away from them. For a mother of 7, she was a singularly unprejudiced point of view. She was, moreover, a fatalist, as she did not attempt to direct things under her control. In other words, she's got a what will be kind of mentality. She found a good deal of time to enjoy the ways of man and nature. So she takes her 7 kids and manages the household well, but she also has an interesting view of Taya. So she said if Taya stopped school, she wouldn't wonder if she could get pretty much all Wunsch's class. People think Taya knows all about Wunsch could teach. So the two of them are talking about what to do with Taya. Um, and down at the bottom, she hates all that diagramming. Oh, this was funny. She hates all that diagramming they have to do. And I think myself, it's a waste of time. I never teach diagramming. It's like what I was telling you last week about my professor in graduate school who used to evacuate the text. It would take all the beauty out of the lines, and all you'd get left would be the noun and the verb. And so that's what diagramming always seemed to me. Um, so they're talking about Taya's potential withdrawal from school, and at the bottom of page 93, she fired up like a little wildcat and said she'd made her own room all by herself, and she didn't think anybody ought to take it from her. So the concept here is that Mr. is going to build a room for Taya to occupy with a piano and give lessons, and so then she will have a living, and we're all thinking to ourselves, oh my gosh, A, don't leave school, and B, this is coming to her artistry is going to come to a screeching halt. But anyway, she says, no, you can't. I'm not going to sleep in that room. You give it to Anna. She'll teach in it, but she's not going to live in it. What's interesting here in this chapter is Taya's parents' view of her. Um, So I forget where they're coming from. Just down at the bottom of 93. She don't mean to be impertinent, father. She's made decided that way. Like my father, Mrs. Kronberg spoke up warmly. I never have any trouble with the child. I remember my father's ways and go at her carefully. So um, she's not trepidatious of Taya. She's respectful of her and approaches her carefully, not because Taya might lose it or some such, but because she doesn't want to um, impo- um, uh, dominate her. Uh, then at the end of the next paragraph, of course, Mr. Kronberg knows what Ray's got in mind. I think Ray Kennedy's planning to spoil a born old maid. So Mr. Kronberg already knows that Taya is not cut out for marriage. Next couple paragraphs, she's so serious that she's never had what you might call any real childhood, hanging around with all those peculiar men. Taya's not the marrying kind, he says. She's too peppery and too fond of having her own way. Then she's always got to be ahead in everything. That kind make good church workers and missionaries and school teachers, but they don't make good wives. So they do have kind of an idea about her. Top of page 95. That's just the point, Mother. A girl with all that energy has got to do something, same as a boy, to keep her out of mischief. If you don't want her to marry Ray, let her do something to make herself independent. In other words, the piano lessons. End of the next paragraph. She nearly cried herself sick about Wunsch's going away. She's the smartest child of them all, Peter, by a long way. I just, I just thought this was an interesting chapter because we're getting the parents' view of her. So she does, in fact, drop out of school at the bottom of this page, and um, at the top of page 96. Oh no, it starts on the previous page. He taught school because he was too lazy. This is the principal among grown-up people, and he had made an easy job of it. He got out of real work by inventing useless activities for his pupils, such as tree diagramming system. So I think this is just another form of diagramming sentences, but it's in the shape of trees. You know, tree diagramming, and Cather tells us it's useless. Um, so she does, in fact, drop out of school. If we go into the next chapter, chapter 15, it is Taya's 15th birthday. Um, and she is now the established music teacher in Moonstone at the top of page 97. She liked the personal independence which was accorded her as a wage earner. Um, then she is challenged by Mrs. Livery Johnson, who says something to her about about what she has said to Mrs. Livery Johnson's daughter, and of course, Taya's 15, so she's not really quite an adult, although in that culture she is pretty nearly so. Um, Down at the bottom, so Mrs. Johnson hollers at her, and Taya was telling Ray about this unpleasant encounter as they were driving out to the sand hills the next Sunday. She was stuffing you all right, Tay, Ray reassured her. There's no general dissatisfaction among your pupils. So she's doing a nice job. But then she says at the top of the next page, but I have to, Ray. They're all so dumb. They've got no ambition, like in contrast to Taya. So she now has received a postcard from a Wunsch. We never do find out his name. It's from Concord, Kansas, and Ray says he has my sympathy. So Ray obviously has been to Concord. He's been really everywhere. Um, and she asked, why? Is that a poor town? It's the jumping off place, no town at all. Some houses dumped down in the middle of a cornfield. You get lost in the corn, not even a saloon to keep things going. So Moonstone at least has a saloon. But this place where Wunsch has now gone is further out, more of a dropping off place than Moonstone. Uh, By the way, Tay, he tells her, I hear the old woman goes to church every Sunday to hear you sing. That's nice. Um, so he tells her, and remember what what we now know about Ray, that the he is the impetus, not the impetus. He is what causes her, allows her, frees her to go to Chicago. He tells her, you want to salt your money down, Tay, and go to Chicago and take some lessons. And then at the top of the next page, um, anyone would have liked to hear Ray's simple and clear account of the performance he had seen at Tabor's Grand Opera House, Maggie Mitchell and Little Barefoot. 15, let's see. The Tabor Grand Opera House is Denver's lavishly decorated opera house, which opened in 1881 and hosted many of the world's great performers up to the turn of the century. And Maggie Mitchell in Little Barefoot, um, that's Margaret Julia Mitchell, a sprightly actress of great popularity. In a 1994 review, Cather complained that Mitchell, who continued to play her most popular ingenue role into her 70s, was diluted and wearisome. Little Barefoot, based on the dramatic drama by Augustus Waldauer, opened with Mitchell as the lead in 1863. Um, Next paragraph, Ray realized that Taya's life was dull and exacting and that she missed lunch. So Taya isn't growing with these piano students who are dumb. Next paragraph, or next few lines, he did everything he could to provide recreation for her, including taking her out to the dunes. He kept his eyes and ears open for anything that might interest her. So he's kind of got his fingers on her pulse. He understands. And down at the bottom, however, um, excuse me. Meanwhile, it was a pleasure enough to feel that she depended on him more and more, that she leaned upon his steady kindness. He never broke faith with himself about her. He never hinted to her of his hopes for their future, never suggested that she might be more intimately confidential with him, or talk to her of the thing he thought about so constantly, and that is marrying her. He had the chivalry which is perhaps the proudest possession of his race. He had never embarrassed her by so much a glance. I bet you, as you were reading along the first time, you must have wondered about Ray. I mean, he's at least 15 years older than she is. And he has his eye on her, but he remains ever the gentleman. At the top of page 101, he often turned to her a face full of pride and frank admiration, but his glance was never so intimate or so penetrating um, as Dr. Archie's. His blue eyes were clear and shallow, friendly and uninquiring. He rested Taya because he was so different, because, though he often told her interesting things, he never set lively fancies going in her head, because he never misunderstood her, and because he never, by any chance, for a single instant, understood her. Yes, with Ray she was safe. By him she would never be discovered. So he does understand her to a degree, but not the place that Wunsch and she discovered. And sometimes she refers to it as some sort of something that lays in her cheek, and sometimes she says that's in her heart. Then we have the next chapter, about Ray's caboose. The one complaint Ray's brakeman had to make of him was that he was too fussy about his caboose. I knew that Cather had used that word. In the next page, he's cleaning up his caboose so that Mrs. Kronberg and Taya can take a ride in it. And he says, Cather says it was properly the brakeman's business to keep the car clean. But when Ray got back to the depot, Giddy, the brakeman, was nowhere to be found. Then Ray found that his brakemen were likely to have what he termed a taste for the nude in art. So they have dirty pictures hanging up on the wall. And I found one of them. It's this. See? Yep, those romantic pictures. Um, and see, oh, that's an odalisque. That's right, right. And um, down a few lines later, underneath the picture was printed the title odalisque. Giddy was under the happy delusion that this title meant something wicked. There was a wicked look about the consonants, but Ray, of course, had looked it up, and Giddy was indebted to the dictionary for the privilege of keeping his lady. If odalisque had been what Ray called an objectionable word, he would have thrown the picture out in the first place. So they've got more of this, and I wrote down somewhere about odalisque. I looked it up. Um, anyway, it's one of these very romantic nudes. Um, that this is typical. My little note says "see picture." Over on page 103, here's this Giddy, and I think Giddy is here to um, present a contrast to Ray. We've just seen how gentlemanly he is with um, with with Taya. And here's Giddy. He admitted smoke disdainfully. I suppose so. The man that gets her will have to wear an apron and bake the pancakes. Well, some men like to mess about the kitchen. He paused, but Ray was intent on getting into his clothes as quickly as possible. Giddy thought he could go a little further, so Giddy's pushing him. Of course, I don't dispute your right to haul women in this car if you want to. Personally, as far as I'm concerned, I'd rather a good deal rather drink a can of tomatoes and do without the women and their lunch. I was never much enslaved to hard-boiled eggs anyway. So he's teasing him for bringing the women into the car. But Ray doesn't care. Excuse me. I don't know if you just heard all that. I don't know if I stopped it or not.